If something is not pleasurable, it's very unlikely that it's going to be successful on a global scale. Pleasure is what dictates to our very primitive instincts what is good. And so pleasure has been hacked mostly through the use of condensed sunlight, which is sugar, through the use of fats, which is another form of condensed sunlight and energy, and salt, which is something that our cells need and our blood needs to transport oxygen, amongst other things, right? So all those three things that are necessary for life, to power consciousness, to power our bodies, and to make circulation happen, that brings us pleasure, have been hacked by the industry in particular.
Climate change. We've never faced a greater threat. Yet all that we produce and consume inflates the debt of greenhouse gases we release. We feel them raise the temp, and the tempest we'll unleash will leave us weeping to forget, unless we take collective action, make a pledge to finally change our ways and keep climate change in check, to benefit the planet and all of its inhabitants. We know it can be done, so listen up and join the quest.
And climate change demands that we change everything that we do. Chad's Climate Quest is brought to you by Regen Intel, activating humanity to become a planet-positive species. Find out more at www.regenintel.earth. Today I'm excited to welcome back Charles Michel, a celebrated educator and visionary in regenerative food systems. Charles's journey began with classical training at the prestigious Institut Paul Bocuse, followed by experience in Michelin-starred restaurants across Europe. However, his passion for broader impact of food led him to explore its magic beyond the kitchen. As a chef in residence at the University of Oxford's Department of Experimental Psychology, he connected culinary arts with academic research to inspire healthier food habits and lifestyles. In 2020, Charles worked as a consultant for the World Food Program in Colombia and has since advised global brands and startups on creating sustainable food programs. Charles is deeply invested in the idea that food literacy can change the world. He creates educational content and experiences all over the world and has delivered over 30 talks on the future of food and conscious eating at venues such as the Royal Society and multiple TED events. His TED Talk on delicious evolution is an absolute must-watch. An active contributor in the field of gastrophysics, Charles has published over 12 papers in peer-reviewed journals and teaches courses on conscious eating, food leadership, sensorial exploration, and transformational experiences at institutions worldwide. His belief in ethical eating emphasizes that our daily choices are powerful tools for social and environmental change, making him a pivotal figure in the movement towards a regenerative food system. Also, since he was last on the episode, he was appointed as the Chief Innovation Officer at Toak Chocolate, one of the world's foremost luxury chocolate companies. For over a decade, Toak has been crafting a blueprint for a regenerative supply chain for cacao, preserving biodiversity corridors and ancient cacao genetics. Together, they are innovating in chocolate making to make deforestation-free chocolate more accessible. Charles, welcome back to the show. Thank you for coming along my Climate Quest.
Thank you, Chad, for the invitation. It's such an honor to be here.
It's really good to have you back on the show, Charles. I kind of feel like we need an episode from you in every season because you're so insightful on how you think about food systems. And really, it's that sort of interesting perspective that you bring to this discussion of food that we just don't hear enough of. And that's why I want to keep bringing you back and back to this show. It's this weaving of quite literally bringing to the table concepts like flavor and experience and perception, things that, we might be familiar with, more or less familiar with, or expecting when we talk about high-end dining. But you also connect that with science, philosophy, and indigenous wisdom. And the way you talk about food is not at all high end, but what I might say is it sounds always to me like livable, our daily relationship with food. So before we get into all that though and unpack it, I would love to hear more about your story, your quest, how you started your journey with food, climate, and regeneration.
Well, the journey with food starts in the breast of my mother, just like all of us. Hopefully, we live because we eat, and there's always been a passion for good flavor and pleasure in the experiences, which I think relates to developmental activity and care and love, that is communicated through the act of eating from a very early age. And I think talking about the future of food without talking about children and education for kids is kind of it's fundamental. So that's where my journey starts. Then I have food people in both of my families, both the Colombian and the French. Grandmothers and grandfathers were involved in it. And more precisely, I think I was passionate about the act of service in food, the act of pleasing others, the act of pleasure and coming together around a fire, around a hearth, or around a table. And that's why I chose to study food, culinary arts, even though my passion was physics and chemistry. And in particular, astrophysics was kind of my path when I was 17, and then I chose to go for cooking. I ended up being a gastrophysicist, which is kind of an interesting turn of events. But with climate, I think it also comes with a personal reckoning. After being, a science kind of informed, evidence based kind of junkie in my youth, let's say. I would only believe in science, and I had a somewhat spiritual reckoning when I met the indigenous peoples in Colombia and their belief systems, which for the first time I resonated with a spiritual belief when they told me about the importance of soil, the divine in the sun, and the dance of the sun and the moon, and how waters would move following the moon. And there's a lot of poetry and spirituality based on the nature of things, and really the nature of reality from a physical perspective, without not to dishonor some great stories that are told in spiritual belief. But there's something about indigenous spirituality which connects to the elements in ways that a lot of other currents don't. And I felt very resonant with that. And in particular, the fact that the earth is or has spirit, it's alive, right? And then it connected with my readings of John Lovelock, who said, the earth, Gaia, is a living mechanism. It's a breathing organism. And so this Gaia hypothesis on the science aspect connected with the more kind of earth religion, so to speak, of indigenous peoples. And that's where the quest of connecting everything I had, which was the passion for science, passion for food, and a quest to reconnect with the elements, to bring back certain type of balance with all life on Earth and the elements. It all comes together on the work I do.
Well, it's a beautiful story, and I find a lot of folks who are entering into the space of regenerative systems, regenerative thinking, often have a similar story, because when you get into the concepts around regeneration and shifting the way we operate, so much of it is at that intersection between science, from what we might say the Western science, or the more globally dominant form of science,
Cartesian.
But also indigenous science.
Yeah.
Cartesian, yeah, exactly. But also there's the indigenous science. And when you start entering into the field more and more into the regenerative systems, you start to see a blending of knowledge systems. And I think that this has been such a powerful motivator for those of us who are on this quest. And this brings you fast forward. And I want to get into a lot of things here, particularly want to get into the concept of gastrophysics, but I want to fast forward a little bit to talk about where you are right now as the Chief Innovation Officer for Tuac Chocolates. And tell me a little bit about how cacao and coca are sort of these amazing plants and ingredients in the foods that we eat all the time, and yet it's so distant from the reality of on the ground. And so there is this part where cacao and coca are do blend that spirituality, the indigenous perspectives, long history of these plants, and into like how we operate today. Like, can you explain a
Yeah.
little bit about how the importance of this in the regenerative system?
Yeah, I think we can talk just talking about cacao, which is the fruit, the plant that you make chocolate from, um, could explain the whole history and present, and maybe the future of food systems. And as some of us may know, a third of global carbon emissions are food system related. And and I think talking about chocolate in particular, which is something that a lot of people relate to, is something that I've chosen not just because of personal conviction, but also because of strategical conviction that we need to use food and pleasure to educate towards systems change. And this happens at an individual level as consumers. It happens on a societal level as we, let's say, vote with our money for particular projects. And then, of course, from a business standpoint, we need to make regeneration better business than degeneration. And so, what does that mean? It means bringing consciousness, whatever we understand by consciousness, to business. And so, in that aspect, that's kind of where Toak comes in. This company I've been working with for a few years now on innovation. But I don't know if you knew this, Chad, but chocolate is the number one plant crop producing greenhouse gas
Mm-hmm.
emissions. Number
Yeah.
one, it is second only to beef for meat. It produces more greenhouse gas emissions than per kilo of food, by the way, to just be precise, more greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of food produced than dairy, than palm, than any other crop or animal you can think of, except for beef grown for meat. And so you never think that eating chocolate is something that is producing so much greenhouse gas emissions. And this is data that I get from Our World in Data, and in particular, combination of a few studies. But it is one of the most carbon intensive foods per kilo. And why is that? Because most of the cacao that you and I have eaten in our lives, most of the chocolate, comes from deforested land where a hybrid variety of cacao, so genetically kind of altered, manipulated variety of cacao was grown in monoculture, using, of course, the classic substances that make monocultures work within a rich ecosystem, biodiverse ecosystem, which is basically to have only one species growing in a particular piece of land. And this is how most of chocolate, most cacao is grown on the planet. And so, what does it mean to create a supply chain for cacao that is not linked to deforestation? Most people don't even know that chocolate production is linked to deforestation in the way that it is, which is massive. And so just there's a lot of education, and through pleasure, we can create avenues for better supply chains. And so that's why I'm so invested in chocolate right now as an education piece, but also to provide like this food that we all love, provide an alternative that is clean in its supply chain and also paying the true cost of food to farmers.
I love that you bring in this concept of pleasure, and I think it's so important. I often use the word joy. I believe really deeply that we've really gotten the idea of overconsumption wrong. And this is what I mean by this. I think essentially humanity operates in order to provide its basic needs for survival and then to find joy in life. And the joy that we experience is the application of those basic needs, but trying to find some pleasure and joy in our homes, in our in our comforts, in our clothing, and all the things that we provide as a basic need for survival. We want to experience a little bit more joy in life. And so we see this overconsumption happening there. But how we then use that principle of joy and, as you say, pleasure as a vehicle through which we can actually make change. It's not really that people are demanding all of this stuff. The stuff isn't what they're asking for. It's the joy that stuff is told to them that it provides, right? The marketing and the advertising say that this providing you with joy and pleasure. It's not really the stuff that they want. It's the pleasure and joy. And so I love that that's approach that you're taking in how to educate and have people interact with food systems or the systems as a whole, because you and I've talked a lot about this over the years, Charles. The food system itself is a great microcosm or a great lens to look at the entire rest of the system because it touches upon everything else. And so I thought maybe you could touch a little bit on that. So you talked about greenhouse gas emissions of cacao and coca and the importance of looking at these regenerative supply chains. But like, walk us through. I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the food system broadly and follow and track that cacao from production to when it enters our stores, and maybe elucidate how this is a vision of the system as a whole.
Yeah. So we're so disconnected from nature today, mostly because of the emergence of an industrialized food system, and in particular the invention of the steam engine, which created a distance between agriculture and the city. This happened around the 19th century. That distance is not only a physical distance, but it is also a distance in understanding the centrality of food in what it means to live a good life. More and more, that gap is kind of broadened by forces of the market, as you mentioned, by let's say the narratives that are out there in terms of what is good to consume, and the bigger the gap, the less sensitive we are to the fact that we are Earthlings, and that for most of our history, let's say as a species, 99.9% of our history was pretty much just everyday work was food. Work was gathering food, was getting together around food. And then when we had that basic need satisfied, we developed language, we developed social structures, etc. And then in the advent of agriculture about 10,000 years ago, we basically created systems of ownership of land that allowed for a somewhat kind of commoditization of food and exchange, which accelerated evolution in a very positive way. But that means that in the last 10,000 years, even then, 99% of our history has been one of being agricultural species. And agricultural means transforming the energy and the nutrients of nature into something that creates pleasure. Why does it create pleasure? Because it is needed for our survival. Now, those pleasure mechanisms have been hacked by, let's say, the narratives of the industrialized food system and the economy to make us consumers instead of actors in a food system and in a good relationship with the elements, nature, and all living sentient beings. So that gap is now as broad as it's ever been. It's going to go even bigger with the devices, the technological capacities that we have in internet. Now, this is where kind of pleasure comes in, and this is where it is important to also, on an ethical level, reshift what we understand by the relationship between humans and food, which could be called gastronomy, right? We need to rethink what that is and bring forth that importance. Now, if we look at reversing climate change, we've talked about this many times. 8 of the 20 top solutions are related to the food system, and in particular, the top, in the top, the ones that can, sequester more carbon are reducing food waste, in particular, eating more plants, which, as you may note, I didn't say eating less animals. Eating more plants sounds much more attractive than restricting you from eating something that brings you pleasure, which is meat, which is something that has an evolutionary basis. And the other one is kind of, basically managing land in a different way. And so when it comes to growing food. And so pleasure here is key in a sense that one of my favorite researchers is Morten Krinkelbach. He looks at the neuroscience of pleasure. And pretty much what one can say is that if something is not pleasurable, it's very unlikely that it's going to be successful on a global scale. Pleasure is what dictates to our very primitive instincts what is good. And so pleasure has been hacked mostly through the use of condensed sunlight, which is sugar, through the use of fats, which is another form of condensed sunlight and energy, and salt, which is something that our cells need and our blood needs to transport oxygen, amongst other things, right? So all those three things that are necessary for life, to power consciousness, to power our bodies, and to make circulation happen, that brings us pleasure, have been hacked by the industry in particular. So fat, sugar, salt is kind of the three main ingredients that the industry has kind of sugar coated with beautiful narratives that make people more unhealthy on one hand, which is, food is also a public health issue nowadays, but it also kind of creates a sense of enoughness and satisfaction um, in regards to, let's say, abundance of food and nutrients that make you oblivious about whatever happened in order for those nutrients to get onto our plates and in our bodies. And there's the biggest ethical problem, because as long as we're feeding enough pleasure to humans, doesn't matter how much kind of resources it's going to take. People are going to continue consuming as long as it is convenient and cheap. And so this is where we have a big issue that, to me, only has one vaccine, which is education, or one solution. Not to use now the word vaccine is even politically charged, so I'm not going to use that word. But it's just like, the solution is food education in particular. Food education, as in, like, food is so central to our history, to our evolution, and maybe even more important than language and music, maybe more important than understanding history. And we're not teaching that at schools. We're not teaching anything at schools. Doctors get like a few hours of nutrition, like medical doctors get a few hours of nutrition in their curriculum, and food is health, right? So what's happening there from even the academic thinking, that food is always considered something of a lower importance, from neuroscience and what my field that I studied at Oxford in sensory science, taste and smell and touch are considered less interesting sensory modalities to study. Vision and audition are the ones that are most important, and the senses that connect us to the elements and to the earth, literally the chemical senses of taste and smell and the tactile senses, are considered of lesser importance. And those are also the flavor senses, right? So in academic thinking and in ethical thinking, food is often considered a second-class priority. And I do feel that we need to bring it forth, especially when we think of the public health issues and environmental issues that stem from that. And also, the flip side is that using food as something interesting, exciting, something that brings inspiration to kids, something that brings social cohesion, something that brings beautiful moments. You can learn about pretty much any field, history, geography, mathematics, economics, anything you can learn through a plate of food, if the right curriculum is applied to explaining how those molecules got in there in that particular way in the first place. So I see the flip side being food education could be a great way to educate on issues of importance. Talk about things that cost governments tons of money, like public health, or and teaching people from an early age how to feed themselves in a balanced way, can have a massive shift. And here I'm thinking of those shifts that are more like of a chess kind of strategical moves, right? Not just checkers of telling you have to reduce your carbon footprint, because it's not led by pleasure. So food is a great way to lead by pleasure and to inspire through pleasure.
I love what you just said here, Charles, because when I think of food as a great way and lens to think about the systems, I think from a economic, like our economic and natural systems, and I often talk about that crust of bread, the drop of oil, or shall we say that piece of chocolate that we consume at the end of the day, and how it goes through every sector of human activity, and our interest and our connections to nature. So it goes from, how we use land, how we produce that, how we cultivate the cacao, and how we harvest it, and then how we package it, and all the factories that are used to package our food, and then we ship it all over the world in trucks and planes and boats that are all consuming fossil fuels and burning and burning fossil fuels and entering the atmosphere and greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, all the way to our grocery stores, which are overstocking in order to meet presumed consumer demand that marketing says that we need to do, all the way to consumers who are over purchasing. And as we know, we've talked a lot about this in the past, Charles, 30 to 40% of food produced is wasted. So it's like taking that, coming home with 3 bags of groceries and taking one of those plastic, tin, paper, and all, throwing it into the trash bin and letting it waste and decompose. So we think about that system in every area of human activity, from energy to buildings to transportation to industry to materials to refrigerant. Everything is touched by food. And you just brought something that I don't think we've had a lot of discussion about so far in these years. And that's, it also touches upon every other aspect of our systems, from education to, we've obviously talked about health and public health, but education and history and and culture and everything every lens that we can approach our interaction with reality, let's say today, food can be at the center of that. And I love what you just described there, because how do we incorporate food in education and food literacy? Is this something that needs to be embedded in school curricula? Is it something that, I just like to unpack that a little bit more, because I recall, growing up in primary school, being inundated by the nutritional pyramids, and being part of my schooling was telling me how much of what types of commodities I needed to be consuming in order to have a nutrient to meet my daily requirements. Mm-hmm. And so part of it, I think, has been put into the educational system, but I think you've touched upon something. It's maybe not the right kind of education, or it's also, I think, as you've pointed out in the past and in discussions, it's the idea of nutrition itself is perhaps part of propaganda, part of a marketing ploy. Can you want to talk a little bit about nutrition and schools and how we kind of integrate this in ways that are actually going to, impact change?
Yeah. So, in a nutshell, I feel that if we teach a good food curriculum to current generations, young generations, right, kids, we could be basically educating the intelligent consumer of the future. And by intelligent, I mean complete self-agency and freedom to choose whatever you want, but making an informed decision and understanding how intricate the ramifications are of every decision that we make when we eat and consume something. And that touches on the ecological fabric of our planet and our societies and the societal kind of type, the relationships that we establish with other humans, right? And then so that is something that I dream as being something very easy to implement. Every school has a science lab, a chemistry lab, and that chemistry lab has access to water and sinks, and it has access to gas. So with very little investment, if you think about it, on a global, like on a mass scale, let's say a whole city, a whole country, applying food education to be taught in the chemistry lab, in the science lab, applying scientific thinking to preparing an egg that at age 5 you can teach a kid, or 7 you can teach a kid cycles of life and biology, and the hen kind of dropping an egg, and then that could become another chicken, right? And the ethics of it. At age 12 you can talk about that a bit more deeply. At age 15 you can talk about the coagulation of albumin, and also the emulsifying properties of lecithin present in the egg yolk. You could talk about very deep science just looking at an egg. And as a result, you can also teach how to cook the egg in a delicious way, how to not wasted. And at age 18, you have adults, young adults, that have agency over their bodies because they will know how to cook. Just like how you write and read is important, I think how to cook is something that there's nothing more human than cooking. We did cooking before we did writing and singing and counting, right? And so it's older, and for some reason it was kind of relegated to only women would take home economics classes, which included cooking, and it's something of like again second class discipline when it really is at the center of our humanity. So I imagine this world in which schools could teach this food discipline, which is gastrophysics, and maybe getting ahead of later question, but that's what I see gastrophysics to be. And gastrophysics, I love the definition. The pioneers in research around this topic. It says that gastrophysics is to gastronomy what astrophysics is to astronomy. In astronomy, you just observe the phenomena in the sky, right? In gastronomy, you just observe the phenomena of the relationship between humans and nature through the food that they kind of consume, right? Food being this kind of vector between humans and nature, right? This life vector. So that's what gastronomy is. Now, astrophysics allowed to apply the laws of kind of physics and chemistry to understand why those kind of stellar or planetary bodies would move in the sky, and we were able to understand the nature of life, the nature of the universe in a deeper way. In the same way, gastrophysics is the applying of scientific kind of knowledge and the laws of nature into understanding why humans relate with their food in the way they do, which is kind of a fascinating kind of, field of inquiry. It's a nascent field of inquiry. It was actually first formulated by Nicholas Curti, a physicist at Oxford who was really passionate about food. This was back in the 70s, 80s. This idea was taken again by researchers about a decade ago, and I was part of some kind of the research that I was doing was kind of under the umbrella also of gastrophysics. But I imagine how in 20, 30 years from now, you could say that you're going to mathematics class and history and language and gastrophysics. And you're learning, a lot of things about, very fundamental kind of knowledge that could help you become a more intelligent consumer. Because it's too late to try and convince some folks about how they need to reduce this or do more of that, because they're so kind of onto their ways that I think we're wasting our time, especially because the strategies are often do this for nature, do this for your health. And that is not the best strategy. You need to convince people through pleasure. And so
joy.
if you're, through joy, exactly. And so, I'm thinking of a more long-term game by thinking of food education.
Well, Charles, you're bringing up gastrophysics, which, honestly, the funny thing, every time I have a conversation with you, I always feel like in this discussion, we could talk every answer. There's about 10 different directions to go, which I love, which means this is why I need you at every season of Chad's Climate Quest. But with gastrophysics, let's ground this principle, because I was going to ask you to explain a little bit more of these fundamentals, which you've just done. Now, how do we give us an example, apply gastrophysics in some sort of concrete way, which we can kind of wrap our heads around? Maybe take chocolate, for example, and cacao. How do we, apply this understanding of looking at science and how our relationship for food, why we're consuming, how we're consuming, and how we're experiencing pleasure? Ground that with it for us a little bit in a clear example, and maybe connect it a little bit to the regenerative approach too. How can we use this to influence global regenerative practices?
All right. So a part of gastrophysics is also understanding how we perceive food, right? The psychophysics of food. So the neuroscience of food or neurogastronomy, let's say, is very interesting because the way we design experiences, sensory experiences, shapes perceptions, and that shapes beliefs, and that shapes consumption patterns on an individual and on a collective scale, right? But it all starts with experience. It all starts with the molecules that are in your mouth and how you perceive them, right? So a lot of gastrophysics research has also shown that our minds are very malleable. And if I tell you you're tasting something, and if I change the color, and if I play a different type of music, your sensation might be twisted to without you even realizing it, right? Uh, you know, reality is very malleable, and of course, brands that use the color red and that talk about happiness would is probably going to make you feel more pleasure because red is associated with sweetness. And if you're told happiness and you believe in it and you trust the brand, then it's going to create happiness for you, right? So a lot of it is an illusion created by narratives, multisensory narratives. We're talking here about experience design. So how do we use this knowledge from neuroscience to craft experiences that convey more pleasure with the things that are less resource intensive, to say it in a simple way?
Mm-hmm.
I imagine, for example, an index. So imagine the amount of natural resources on one hand, right? The amount of water and carbon and land use and all of that. And on the other hand, you get the amount of pleasure and sensation that you get from particular food. Just thinking about, for example, that index, let's call it the regenerative food index, right? That designing that index and creating, here's a research idea that I'm throwing to you. This is not in the literature yet.
That sounds like a climate quest if I ever heard one.
Right? So imagine crafting like principles, guidelines that would maximize the pleasure and the sensation that you get from the lowest amount of resources needed, right? That index could be of a factor of a ton of different things, and has to have a podcast just talking about that index, right? Just planting a seed here. But if we were able to design that index, we would be able to understand much better what to serve and how to serve to people in order to make them make the choice that is better to increase our chances of survival on this planet. Because the quest is of existential proportions, right? So, and even if we're just reducing 10% the amount of food that is wasted, or 20% the amount of water use, right? Instead of eating avocado every day, you're eating avocado once a week. That can reduce by 5 the amount of water use and carbon footprint, not to mention the social issues related with avocado growing, that can have a shift in your personal consumption, but also as a collective. Because we're obsessed with fighting people who eat beef. I agree that we need to reduce our beef consumption for sure. But if you just replace beef by avocados, then you're just changing. I don't know which one is of a lesser evil. Like you're just changing one issue for another, and so it is important that we truly kind of look at this with a more scientific eye, as in human consumption of food is an evolutionary force. We shape landscapes, we shape health, we shape the future of our planet with the way we consume. And again, food is considered a second kind of class field. And so there's a lot to say about that. And I think that starting with food education, I mean, policy making is a big one here, because policymakers have a lot, I think, to bring to the table when it comes to rewarding good practices and making, let's say, bad practices reduce or pay their fair kind of share of taxes when it comes to higher consumption. But I mean, all of this we could also just talk about economics, right? And unfortunately, it is a great business that a third of global food production is wasted because it's paid for. It is paid for, and it consumes fossil fuels, and it consumes all kinds of things that make the economy run. And so, if we
Yeah.
don't talk about economics, I mean, all that I said is kind of almost worthless. We need to talk about kind of shift in economic systems, and that's yeah, another topic.
There's a lot of things you've just really opened up here, Charles. First, I'd like to say I absolutely do think that we should think about a research project to create a regenerative food index, really mapping what you've just described and there's like it's a matrices here, right? Like thinking about the pleasure principle with regenerative practices, and then creating that index that compares that to the amount of resource use. I think that is brilliant, and you just kind of really got me excited about that kind of research project. And I think that's doing something like that is probably foundational if you want to change systems, if you want to change that economic system, understanding what how the economy can respond to gastrophysics, that applying the science and understanding of pleasure and how and why we are interacting with food can be, in the current economic system that we're operating, profitable for folks if they think about it. Now, of
Absolutely.
course, I do think we need to fundamentally shift our economic systems to move towards well-being, but in the systems we're operating now, to make the changes that we need to right now, setting up that principles of understanding that relationship between food pleasure and resource use and finding alternatives, I think is really brilliant. And I think it's obviously fundamental. And you talked about policy and you talked about economics, and I think all of that is true. But there's another part of it that I think I'd like to comment on, and that's the myths and realities of our storytelling, if you will. And we can say storytelling is a very popular word these days, but essentially storytelling is media. It is advertising. It is propaganda. You and I both have a background in studying and researching propaganda, for good, for bad. These are just vehicles through which we disseminate ideas and try to impact behavior, of course, which is ubiquitous all around us. And so I want to get to, I think that is a really powerful leverage tool for, changing how we understand and relate to the pleasure principle that you and I need to do a research project on. I'm going to pin that as a absolute must for us to do. But saying, it's about time we did a research project together, Charles. But
Yeah.
the other side of it is the myths and realities that our marketing, advertising, storytelling conveyed to us, and that weaves into our education, weaves into our way we operate in our grocery stores and the way we operate in our families and communities. And I want maybe to talk a little bit about that, because that also brings me back to an earlier point I made around nutrition, that nutritional pyramid is kind of a myth, right? That we were taught back in the 80s and early 90s. And so maybe you could touch a little bit upon that storytelling, the power of storytelling, advertising, marketing, propaganda, however lens we want to look at it in this discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, this part of around storytelling, really, I feel is the secret sauce to figure out if humans are going to keep being the apex predator of the planet and turn into the apex regenerator of the planet,
Yes.
purely biological terms, right? Although you could argue that mosquitoes are even higher apex predators than us because they eat us, right? And there's nothing we can do about it. So, but I do think that there's a recipe in storytelling, and to be honest, like gastrophysics is a story, right? All science is based on stories and stories that we believe in, and
Right.
if there's enough evidence to back them, then we get behind them, right? Um, Carl Sagan did a great thing in his life, like really making us dream about, wow, the magic, the awe of understanding our place in the universe, right? Through his Cosmos series and book and all his scientific work. And I think that is something of the kind of size that we need in order to to re-enchant people with food and eating, and
Mm.
understanding that when you are relating to food, you are relating to a living system of the earth. You are relating to the energy of the sun, the moon, the stars, the whole kind of stardust kind of conversation, right? Everything is made of stardust. Yeah, well, everything is powered by starlight, and that starlight
Yeah.
all comes from our sun. Like we're trying to figure out photovoltaic energy, and we don't talk about the energy that fuels humans, right? We're more interested about the energy that fuels our machines than the energy that fuels our consciousness. And so, here I'm throwing in like different narratives and ideas that are very potent if you really look at them in a different way. Now, these could create, in my opinion, not just a new form of ethics when it comes to thinking about ethics, even, but when thinking about kind of what is important to a human being in this time and age. Um, it also is something of a kind of transformational power, in our relationship to each other, in our relationship to all living sentient things. And there's of course a kind of spiritual aspect to this, but I also think it's the opportunity to create a new way of doing business, a new way of basically decentralizing and deindustrializing our food systems. Think of community gardens, educational, public funded community gardens in every city in the world, in every neighborhood in the world. Think about food systems that are integrated within the everyday life in ways that reduce the amount of methane produced by landfill, because there would now be food there. All the food waste
Mm.
would go to create soil, and all that soil would be distributed to not need fertilizers in foods in where we grow foods. Right? There's so many ways there, and also one of the greatest issues of our time, from a health perspective, is mental health and isolation. And you could tie in depression, you could tie in addiction, to this. What if there would be more public spaces devoted for connection, true
Hmm.
connection? And there's nothing that connects you more than growing food, because this is what we've been doing for thousands of years, right? It's embedded in our DNA, and people remember when they kind of get back into touching soil and growing food, and the satisfaction of it. So, public spaces with growing food, but also for big business, thinking differently
Mm.
about how we can make people think and understand food, with the sustainable development goals in mind, um, that can reduce water consumption without taking a bit of the pleasure that we get from food. Because if you take pleasure from people, people get angry. That's what's happening, and that's why we're so polarized, even on issues like climate change. Why? This is my personal hypothesis, and here I feel like we're more like on a, having a friends conversation, But my personal opinion is that people are so polarized about even not believing in climate change and global
Hmm.
warming, because they're afraid that someone's going to take away their burger and their steak, and that's a core part of their identity. And I understand why someone would get angry if you take away something that's part of their identity. So no one's going to take away anything from anyone. What if, right? No one's going to take anything from everyone, but and especially not like the government telling you that you need to do this, right? That's not going to work. Now, bottom up, pleasure driven, better foods for everyone, you know, democratic access to food education, and eventually even a crazy idea that I've been talking in a lot of talks, which is universal basic nutrition. I mean, it's fine that we give people universal basic income, and I love that idea. But how about universal basic nutrition? Public funded food systems who give people the base needs in food, and I assure you, you can solve a lot of social issues just by feeding people their fair rate of nutritious food and reduce food waste at the same time, and provide better opportunities for regenerative businesses, etc. So there's so much in here, right? But here, just throwing away, like, you talk to me about narratives, like, this is why I respond. Like, there's so much that can be done there that is, to me, very exciting.
There is so much to be done, Charles, but I'm going to push back a little bit with you on this. And it's not, I agree with everything you've said, of course. We are having a friends conversation. We always do. So I agree. Every point that you made, and everything is, there's even more things. You always it's like a spitball of brilliant ideas that we should really continue on. Like, I want to map the regenerative food index to the regenerative development goals that we want to. So we talk about SDGs, that's sustainable development goals, but we're also working on regenerative development goals. And so like link that up. But I want to push back a little bit because what I think is one of the big challenges is that you're up against an advertising and marketing industry that is powerful, that are amazing storytellers. And we can say storytellers, but we can also describe this as, as I said before, it's about brand management. It's about telling us the story of some, I forget what is it, the cheetah that eats, Cheetos, that are flavor engineered in a lab that says that this is delicious and cool. And, that's the story we're up against, right? And that's just a silly example, but that's ubiquitous across the advertising and marketing worlds, which I think is that story, the alternative, or the storyline of the system that we're operating in today, as an example, as a really simple example. But that is ubiquitous, I think, particularly in our global economy, and linking that economic discussion as well. And I think when we're talking about storytelling, about regenerative practices, about how pleasure principles with food, about how to understand the importance of eating and consuming regeneratively produced cacao, chocolate, like, you're up against a huge industry. And so I'm curious, and how do we actually craft storytelling and narrative that can steer people away from the Cheetos character or whatever to something else, right? And I love that you brought up Carl Sagan. Don't get me wrong. I think that's another brilliant idea. I think you should be pitching Netflix immediately for, the Charles Michel's version of Carl Sagan's Cosmos. I think you are also a Regen Intel Cosmos star. I mean, I think, you could be the Carl Sagan of the food. I think that's something that absolutely would be brilliant. But there's also this other side about creating the narratives around pleasure that for these regenerative food, produced food, and healthier food and more nutritious food that is science-based, cultural, like harkening back to the history and culture that you've described, because again, we have this connection to our grandmother's recipes. We always love to hear that. We always want to consume that, right? So it's there, and yet how do you combat or put that up against the Cheetos character or whatever it is? I'm sorry, I probably should not be picking on a particular brand, and I'm not trying to get into that. I just the point
make listeners crave Cheetos.
I know everyone's now going to be their taste buds are going, I want that Cheetos.
Crunch.
Right.
Yeah, I think we don't need to reinvent the wheel. I just think we need to play the same ball game that is already proven successful, and we need to be clever at doing that. I think there's so many ways I could respond to this. Just let me get my ideas in a row, my ducks in a row. There is this idea that we have, like, narratives to craft, and there's the big questions behind the marketing agency and the advertisement is who is fueling, literally, those forces, those storytelling forces, and all roads lead to Rome, to a particular a very good business, which is basically fossil fuel powered and food system, fossil fuel crafted food system, whether it is the engines that transport from far away, whether it is the fertilizers, right? If you eat a Cheeto that is grown from corn that is made from corn, that is grown from petrochemical fertilizers, you are what your food eats, is something that I like as a narrative, right? We don't know what our food eats. And so we're always like, oh, you are what you eat. Yeah, but what does your food eat? If your salmon eats food waste, then you are eating that, right? If your if your avocado is, has water that violates the water rights of people in the high Andes in Chile, then you are like consuming that, right? So there's something about that level of consciousness that is interesting. But anyways, I'm getting sidetracked. Back to the point of the narratives and how do we make them better. There's one research that, unfortunately, it's my biggest regret that we didn't publish it because we ran out of steam, and it was just kind of, one of the researchers dropped out and kind of got in the weeds. But we got some really pretty decent results with over 40 participants per condition. And we basically changed the story that we gave to this was basically the same food that we gave to all participants. And we changed the story. We told 4 different stories, 3 stories and 1 control. And we asked people how likely they were to adopt this new innovative food into their diets. One story was this diet, 3 arguments for being good for health. The other story was 3, so the whole story, 3 arguments being good for the environment. And both of those conditions, people felt less pleasure when eating the freaking cookie. So it made it less sweet, less delicious, and of course, less likely to adopt it into their diets. The fact that the narrative anchored the experience to health or environment made people believe that it had to be less delicious. Because if it's good for the environment, it's just less delicious, right? They're taking something away from me. They're reducing something. They're giving me something weird in it. It's probably going to taste less delicious, and it tasted less delicious. Remember, every condition had the same amount, like the same cookie, exactly. The people that were told the story that 3 arguments on why other humans were liking this cookie made people perceive the cookie as being sweeter, more delicious, and they were more likely to adopt it into their diets. And that was higher than the control condition. So what I'm trying to say here is that all of us who are caring about the earth, caring about climate, caring about this, right? And all the variety of justice issues that surround that, we're often playing checkers, and we should be playing chess. Playing checkers is telling you this is good for the environment, and that's my main argument because it's true. Skip. Like, that doesn't work. Telling people what they should do for their health is proven to be exactly the opposite. You even create like more anxiety. Like, even the tobacco kind of advertisement and showing you like sick people on it creates more anxiety and makes you want to smoke more, right? So it's you need to guide through pleasure. And a big part of that is the phenomenon of the massive queue outside of the restaurant, which has also been studied. That people don't even know what they're going to get, but as long as there's some people queuing, then you want to try, because if other people like it, I'm surely going to like it. We're pretty much basically sheep in many of our behaviors, and this is something that even if you know you're a sheep, you're still a sheep. It's very hard to break, right? And even if you're contrarian, like you're just, the other group of sheep, but it makes you feel good that you're contrarian somehow, and that gets you pleasure. So, anyways, just getting kind of into the weeds again. The point being that for narratives, we just need to craft around like the gastrophysics of perception to create narratives that we know are going to be more successful in getting people to make the right choice. And that, it means playing chess. And when we talk about narratives also, we can talk about the narratives of advertisement. I feel that those are much less powerful than the narratives of politics. Because the narratives of politics end up really pulling the thread. And so how do we put this on a more political agenda is a big question. It's already happening, right? but we're also super polarized, and we're not, we're just kind of gets complicated. So the point being, like, how do we drive through pleasure, and how do we bring in kind of those more kind of chess moves into innovation on a global scale, and on a political scale, and on an economic scale that can affect change? I think that's one of the greatest challenges in the coming decades.
Well answered. And I don't want to get into the political discussion now because we don't have time. I think we're going to have to do that for the next season episode with you, Charles, the politics and economics of food.
Yeah.
And we also can see the culmination of this year's political turmoil that we're experiencing all over the world without getting into it too much. But I do want to, I mean, if we can I have two more questions for you that I just think I really want to ask you in this before we close today's podcast. So listeners, my apologies for going a little bit longer than our usual timing, but I just want to really touch upon these two things. One is you talk a lot about the global impact and yet also the bottom up. And I wanted to maybe touch upon the role of local communities. And community contexts that play a role not only in like the production of food systems, but our experience of pleasure, our experience of the storytelling, the education, all these things that we've talked through this whole session on, boils down to what is the right approach to be taking? Should we be focused on the national, the global, or the local? And I know this is like, I'm not even talking necessarily about local supply chains versus global supply chains. I mean, that we'll save that for our next episode on politics and economics. But just talking about the narrative, the education component, the history, the experience of pleasure. I want to think through that because again, we have these globalized brands that often push out the pleasure principle. I mean, they understand pleasure principles very, very well with the snacks and things that they eat. And so I just want to push that idea. Like, what's that tension between global and local, in your opinion, in these in making change?
I could answer that, and also just want to bring kind of a different perspective, which is what instead of talking about global, local, etc., we talk about relational. Whether it is local or global doesn't matter as much as what is the type of relationship that we're establishing. And here I'm talking supply chain, I'm talking communications, I'm talking knowledge, I'm talking education, a lot of different things that can make it better to consume a particular product or another, and a less kind of like a less normative or normalized, or let's say kind of average kind of consumption for all humanity, but rather creating a more diverse set of connections and relationships. Whether they're local or global depends on context, what's best, right? But it is about a deep focus on how we create those relationships. If I can tell you that right now I can have one touch point, literally one, between you and your pleasure of eating chocolate and people who grow cacao in a forest, harvesting from different trees that haven't been planted by humans. They're just there, right? And they transform it, and they give it to you. That's relation, right? But it might not work for everybody, because you would have to pay the true cost of chocolate, and that means probably over $10 for a 50-gram bar, for an ounce bar, right? That's the real cost. It's the true cost of chocolate. So it doesn't work for everyone. And we can find other type of solution for someone who cannot afford more than $3. And maybe that even involves not chocolate or all chocolate, something that looks and tastes and feels like chocolate, that is made of carob, fermented, and that for 99% of the population would even notice there's no cacao in their chocolate, right? Are you lying to them? Not if you're giving them the pleasure. It's alt choc. You can't call it chocolate, right? But then for that kind of market demographic, that would work. So one can be local, ish. The other one is global, but the truth is that we all love, most people love chocolate, right? And we're going to keep on consuming it. And it's going to be one of the products that, due to climate change, is going to rise in price the fastest.
Yeah.
And it actually shows, for those of you who are into chocolate, the commodity price of cacao went times 6, more than Bitcoin in the past year. Right now, trading at around $10,000 after it has been historically around $2,000 per ton of dried cacao. And so there's something interesting to say about that. Why is that? Because there's been panic buying from the big players in chocolate industry, and due to a small production due to climate change, because more diseases have been appearing in monocrop chocolate and decimated the production, in particular in the west of Africa, where most of the commodity cacao comes from. So there's, here again, economics, narratives. I mean, there's a lot there, that again, it's about building good relationships. And if you listen to, indigenous wisdom, and they'll tell you, well, to live in right relationship, and it's all about relationships and how you establish them. The thing is that right now we've literally kind of given away the thinking about our relationships when it comes to food, because it's just so convenient to go to a supermarket and get your fix of foods. I'll end with this on this particular question. An indigenous elder once told me that the food system, or the garden, which I translate into food system, is kind of the umbilical cord that connects us with nature, to mother, right? The way that we are doing this now, food system, is not through the umbilical cord, because there's no emotional connection, there's very little knowledge. It's rather through a perfusion of nutrients that we get fixes at corner shops, whether it is the 7-Eleven or the supermarket, or ordering on Uber, or whatever it is, or restaurants. We're just getting our fix of nutrients, and we are completely oblivious about anything that happened before that. We just want our fix, right, of pleasure and nutrients. Now, that's one system, and the other, and the main difference here is the quality of the relations that you are establishing by design of the system. So, yeah.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you. And yes, I agree, particularly when we think about the politics and economics of the system, and our desire to feel that joy and pleasure. And I also think that relational elements of connecting in our own communities and having those stronger relationships between family and friends, and in the place space that we are in, have that great opportunity to educate ourselves and to create these opportunities for experiences, which I know is such an important part of your work. It's creating experiences that can help us shift those mindsets to be more regenerative consumers of deliciousness, let's just say. But Charles, I have one last question I ask all of my guests. If you could be succinct about it, because you've already answered it last time. But that is, I want to hear if anything's changed. What is your vision for a regenerative future, and how do you see your role in creating it?
My vision of a regenerative future is one where we are in honor and good relationship with life systems, and in particular food being like a vector of life, a vector of nutrients, and our most intimate connection with natural ecosystems. I find it important to create what Caroline Steele, a thinker that I really admire, talks about as Seatopia, which is turning cities into food places, and bringing that connection again that we have imprinted in our DNA to be hunters and gatherers and growers of food, and gathering around fires and sharing it, right? So I see kind of in a technological future, just like more connection to the elements, even within the cities, in particular from the cities. And what my role is in it, I just want to, I like telling stories. I like envisioning and bringing awe to the importance and the beauty of food. We are literally, this conversation was literally powered by starlight, by the sun. And we are photovoltaic machines, as in like we eat plants that are photovoltaic in essence, in a way, capturing photons and turning them into condensed energy, so we can have this conversation. And there's something about a re-enchantment when it comes to food and eating, and that may be the role that I want to play.
Well, Charles, it's been a joy for me. Speaking of joy, it's been a joy and pleasure having you again on My Climate Quest today. Your journey is inspiring, fascinating, and I always love hearing you speak about one of my favorite subjects. And I think it's almost everyone's favorite subject, and that is food coming together around deliciousness. I really like to say, you're giving our listeners a lot of food for thought. Excuse me,
I get that every time.
That will energize and motivate them to think deeper about their relationship with food. So, thank you for sharing your wisdom and experiences with us.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure, Chad. Thank you so much. I honor your quest as well, and super excited to see what we continue weaving.
Well, folks, that's it for this episode of Chad's Climate Quest. Stay tuned for our next episode when I'll be talking to yet another planetary grade thinker and doer implementing solutions to create a regenerative future. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome you on My Climate Quest. This podcast is brought to you by Regen Intel, a public benefit advisory and education platform training the next generation of leadership for a better planet, and co-produced and distributed by our incredible partners, Better Worlds, Soar Studios, and Shikonomy. Special thanks to Michael Katijian, aka Inverse K, for the incredible intro number for Season 3 of this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others. And to learn more about Regen Intel, check out our Foundations program at www.regenintel.earth/education. Applications are accepted all year round. See you next time on Chad's Climate Quest.